Dog in the Arena, Chapter 13. Ranger burst into the hot sun of the arena floor. He ignored the gritty sand that irritated his paws. He ignored the too loud screams of the crowd. He ignored everything except the two men at the center of the amphitheater and raced towards them, barking as loud as he could. The crowd's shouts turned into a gasp, one great collective breath of surprise. What was a dog doing in the arena during the fight? Ranger kept barking. Cleto turned in surprise, his sword still poised to strike, but before he could act, Ranger leapt at him. He tackled Cleto the way he tackled Luke when they were roughhousing in the yard at home. Cleto tumbled backward. He didn't laugh like Luke would have. Even through the dark holes of the metal mask, Ranger could sense the anger in his eyes. Cleto sprang to his feet and whipped around. Ranger bounded away. He raced around the arena, running in a circle close to the crowd. They were cheering now, cheering for him, as if he were part of the show, brought in by the Emperor to entertain them like the ostriches and the lions and the gladiators. Marcus heard the cheers and opened his eyes. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The dog had stopped the fight. Cleto stood at the center of the arena, turning in confused circles as Ranger galloped around him. Quintus struggled to his feet, blood dripping from his wounded arm. He limped towards his net, all wadded up on the sandy floor. He needs more time, Marcus thought. He clutched his hands together and prayed to the gods for help. Maybe if the dog kept running, kept playing the clown. But in that moment, Cleto remembered his opponent. He was not entertained by Ranger's antics, like the crowd was. Just as Quintus was reaching for his net, Cleto jumped in front of him and lifted his sword. No! Marcus sprung to his feet and raced from the tunnel. He screamed until his lungs burned. He waved his arms wildly the way the trainers did to distract a runaway animal so it could be snared. Cleto only lifted his gaze for an instant, but that was enough. Ranger bounded across the sandy floor, barking and barking. Cleto spun around, and when he did, Quintus flung out his net with all his might. The leaden weights clinked against Cleto's shield as the net wrapped around him. "Your trident!" Marcus pointed to where it lay on the sand, and Quintus limped toward it as Cleto freed himself from the net. He struggled to entangle his sword and his shield, and when he realized that they were hopelessly snared, he threw off his bulky helmet, rushed at Quintus, and slammed his body against him. The two men tumbled through the sand with flailing arms and pounding fists. Both were filthy and exhausted. Cleto was atop Quintus when the arena official's sword dropped between them. Enough! The two men froze mid-battle. They stared at each other out of breath. Their lips were curled and their eyes empty. Sweat poured down from their temples. Ranger stopped running. He stood next to Marcus, panting in the muggy afternoon air. The arena official took hold of the two gladiators' wrists, one in each hand, and pulled them to their feet. Then he turned and looked up into the stands, to the balding man in the purple robes. Emperor Domitian had risen to stop the fight at the request of the screaming mob. Marcus looked up, waiting for what he knew must come next. The emperor would raise one hand to declare Cleto or Quintus the victor. Then the crowd would decide the fate of the other man. Marcus knew what would happen if Quintus lost. Marcus thought he might suffocate on the muggy amphitheater dust. It felt as if the two men had used up all the air in the arena during the fight. But Marcus made himself keep breathing, keep watching. The emperor stared down at the gladiators. Marcus wished he could see inside that man's mind. Both men had fought bravely, but only one must be declared a winner. Would Quintus be killed because he had lost weapons and suffered a wound? Marcus held his breath. Chapter 14. The Emperor's Decision. The Emperor did not move. Marcus tried to read the expression on his chiseled face, but it was impossible. Perhaps Domitian would spare Quintus, even if he lost. But deep down Marcus knew that it was too much to hope from a ruler who was famous for his cruelty. Why would he show mercy to a gladiator who had broken all of the rules? The arena official stood on the floor, waiting, still clutching the two gladiators' wrists, looking up at Domitian. The arena fell silent. The emperor stared back. Then the crowd began clapping again, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until their hands and stomping feet made a thunder that seemed to shake the whole amphitheater. Finally, the emperor raised both of his hands, and the mob let out a roar louder than any other. Marcus gasped. The emperor had declared both men victorious. The arena official lifted both of their hands high into the air. It seemed as if the screaming and chanting and stomping and clapping might never end. When it finally did, the official wrapped a piece of cloth around Quintus's wounded arm. The emperor sent a man down with gifts for both the gladiators. They were palm leaves for victory and wooden swords. Marcus felt his eyes fill with tears. Quintus had won not only his fight, but his freedom. The rare gift of the wooden sword from the emperor meant that the gladiator's service was at an end. Quintus was free, and that meant Quintus would soon be gone. Marcus turned away. He squatted down to pet the dog and tried to hide the tears welling up in his eyes. He knew he must be happy for his gladiator brother. Perhaps one day he would fight as bravely. One day. Boy! Marcus felt a rough hand around his arm. The official pulled him up and turned him to face the edge of the arena. The emperor has called for you and your dog as well. Marcus swallowed hard. He was responsible for the dog that interrupted the fight. Surely he would be punished for interfering with the match. He took a deep breath, looked down, and put his hand on Ranger's warm head. Somehow it made him feel less alone in the big arena. When Marcus lifted his gaze, Domitian was staring down at him. The emperor motioned to a servant on the arena floor, an older man who walked with a slow limp. The man stepped up to Marcus and Ranger. He knelt down slowly and ran a hand over Ranger's fur. When he stood, he gave Marcus a palm leaf. Today's victory is yours as well, he said, and then he held out a wooden sword. It was so much larger and heavier than the toy Marcus had lost in the fire. Marcus stared at it. Certainly this could not have the same meaning as Quintus's sword. He reached out for it. Thank you, he said. Is it a toy? The servant tipped his head. With his thin white hair fluttered in the hot breeze. It is your freedom, young man. If you are wise, you will show your thanks to the emperor now. Marcus turned and bowed deeply. The crowd's shouts roared in his ears. When he stood again, he looked at the old man who presented him with the sword. I am most grateful, but I do not understand. He said, I am no gladiator. I have not fought for the emperor or the people of Rome. No, you are right about that. You have not, the man said. His eyes looked tired, and they crinkled at the corners when he smiled. But today, you and your dog gave them the one thing that they love more than blood. The servant looked up at the crowd of Romans, still on their feet, still cheering. You gave them a story, one they will talk about for a long time to come. Marcus looked up into the stands until the cheers faded and the people began filing out through the amphitheater's numbered doors to go home. When he turned back to the arena floor, Cleto was already walking out through the Porta Triumphalis, the gate of the victors. But Quintus stood there waiting for Marcus. He gestured toward the same gate. Shall we go? We're free now, my brother. We are, Marcus looked at him. You can take your winnings and go home now, to your real brother and the bakery. The trouble is, we are in need of more help. Quintus's face was smeared with sweat and drying blood, but his eyes lit up when he grinned. And you must remember, I have 2 brothers now. Will you come work with us? Marcus clutched his wooden sword so hard that the splinters pricked his palms, but he hardly felt them. Yes, of course I will, thank you. I am glad. Marcus looked down at Ranger. Perhaps we'll have a bakery dog now as well. Marcus knelt down and scratched Ranger behind the ears. Then he flung his arms around the dog's neck and whispered, Thank you, dog. Ranger leaned into the whisper and the snuggle, but another sound made his ears prick up, a high-pitched humming. Ranger stepped back from Marcus and tipped his head. The sound was coming from the tunnel that led into the arena. Ranger took a few steps away. The humming grew louder. Where are you going, dog? You must come with us. The victor's gate is this way. Marcus pointed in one direction, but Ranger didn't come. He took another step towards the tunnel. He will come if he wishes, Quintus says quietly. He put an arm around Marcus and looked thoughtfully at Ranger. But perhaps this dog has another home. Home. Ranger was ready to go, but first he trotted back to Marcus for one last scratch. Don't you want to come? Marcus knelt down, scratching Ranger behind the ears. You are free now. You will have a home with us at the bakery. Ranger looked back at the tunnel. The humming grew louder. Marcus sighed. Well, whether you come with us or not, you must have this. He tore a blade from the palm leaf. Today's victory was yours as well as ours. He swallowed hard and tucked the leaf under Ranger's collar. "I will never forget you, dog." The leaf was scratchy, but Ranger didn't paw at it. He gave Marcus one last nuzzle and then turned and walked into the cool, dark tunnel. Ranger followed the humming sound to the corner of the stone walls. He found the old first aid kit right where Marcus had tucked it on the day Ranger had arrived. When Ranger nuzzled the dusty strap over his head, the humming got louder. It drowned out all the wild animal sounds coming from the amphitheater basement and the people noises from Rome spilling in from the street. Ranger saw a pinprick of white light escape from the corner of the old metal box. It grew brighter and brighter until Ranger had to close his eyes. He opened them just in time to see Sadie kick the soccer ball past Luke into the net. Chapter 15. "No fair!" Luke yelled, booting the ball back out into the lawn. "I wasn't ready." He looked down at Ranger. "Where'd you go, Ranger? Have you been running around through Mom's garden again? What's that?" Luke reached for the palm leaf and pulled it out under Ranger's collar. "Where'd you get this?" Sadie ran up to see it. "It looks like one of those leaves from Nana's palm tree in Florida." "We don't have palm trees here," Luke frowned. Ranger nudged Luke's hand with a wet nose. "Don't worry," Luke laughed and tucked the leaf back under Ranger's collar. "Wherever you found it, it's yours to keep, Ranger." "Who's ready for pancakes and sausage?" Dad called from the front porch. Sadie and Luke raced for the door. Ranger started to follow them, but he stopped at the bottom of the steps and breathed in all the home smells. Luke and Sadie, grass and soccer ball leather, a faint whiff of Ruggles, the next door cat, and sausage, home sausage. "Come on, boy." Luke held out the door open, and Ranger bounded up the steps and followed him inside. Before Ranger went to the kitchen to lick the sausage grease off of Mom's hand, he stopped in the mudroom. Ranger wiggled the leather strap from around his neck, and the old first aid kit dropped into his dog bed. It was quiet now, no more humming. Ranger pawed at his collar until the palm leaf slipped out. It dropped onto the pillow next to the old quilt square that Ranger had brought back from his last adventure. He could still smell Marcus's scent on the leaf. Marcus had a family now, with Quintus, and Ranger was certain that Marcus had a brother and a home. And now Ranger was home too. He gave the palm leaf one last sniff and pawed at the wool blanket on his dog bed until the metal box, the quilt square, and the palm leaf were covered up. Then Ranger padded into the kitchen, licking his chops. His job was done. It was time for sausage.